Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, welcome to our community of curious minds who love diving deep into history's most fascinating stories. Before we begin tonight's journey, get yourself comfortable. Grab your favorite blanket, adjust your pillows, dim those lights and settle in because we're about to embark on a truly extraordinary adventure through time. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that will completely change how you think about power, about human nature, and about what it truly means to hold the fate of millions in your hands. Imagine for just a moment that you wake up tomorrow morning and discover that every single decision you make will affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Every word you speak could start a war or bring peace. Every signature you write could feed the hungry or leave them starving. Every person you trust could either protect your legacy or destroy everything you've built. This isn't a fantasy. This is the reality that has been lived by the most powerful individuals throughout human history. And tonight, we're going to step into their shoes and experience what that overwhelming responsibility actually felt like. We're going to explore the minds of emperors who commanded armies larger than entire modern cities, kings who owned more land than some countries, and leaders whose single word could determine whether civilizations thrived or crumbled into dust. But here's what's truly fascinating. Despite having all this incredible power, many of these individuals lived in constant fear, struggled with loneliness that most of us could never imagine, and often made decisions that haunted them for the rest of their lives. So get comfortable, close your eyes if you'd like, and let me transport you back through time to experience what it was really like to be the most powerful person on Earth. Our story begins in ancient Rome, around 27 BCE, with a man named Gaius Octavius, who would become Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. Picture this, you're a young man, barely in your 30s, and you've just inherited control over an empire that stretches from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to modern-day Iraq in the east. You control more territory than anyone in human history up to that point. But here's the thing that no one tells you about ultimate power. It's absolutely terrifying. Every morning Augustus would wake up in his palace on the Palatine Hill, and before he even opened his eyes, he would have to consider whether today might be the day someone tries to assassinate him, just like they did to his great-uncle Julius Caesar. He would dress carefully, choosing clothes that projected strength but not arrogance, because even his clothing choices could spark political controversy. As he walked through the marble halls of his palace, past countless servants and guards, he carried the weight of knowing that his decisions that day would affect whether families in Gaul would have enough grain to survive the winter, whether soldiers on the Germanic frontier would live or die in battle, whether trade routes would remain open or close, affecting the livelihoods of merchants from Alexandria to Londinium. Augustus had to master the art of appearing confident and decisive while internally wrestling with impossible choices. Should he expand the empire's borders, risking the lives of thousands of soldiers, but potentially securing more resources for Roman citizens? Should he trust his generals in distant provinces, knowing that giving them too much power might lead to rebellion, but giving them too little might result in military disasters? Every person who approached him wanted something. Senators seeking political favors, merchants requesting trade privileges, generals demanding more troops, governors asking for more funding for their provinces. And Augustus knew that behind every smile, every bow, every expression of loyalty, there might be someone plotting his downfall. The loneliness of ultimate power meant that Augustus could never be completely sure who genuinely cared about him as a person versus who simply wanted to use his authority for their own gain. He would spend hours each day reading reports from across the empire, accounts of barbarian raids, crop failures, plague outbreaks, political unrest, religious conflicts, economic problems. Each report represented human suffering that, in theory, he had the power to address, but in reality, he had to choose which problems to prioritize, because even the most powerful person on Earth couldn't solve everything at once. Imagine trying to sleep at night knowing that while you're resting comfortably in your palace, somewhere in your empire, people are dying from diseases that better medical supplies could cure, but you've allocated that money to defense instead. or knowing that you've ordered a military campaign that will almost certainly result in thousands of deaths, but you believe it's necessary to prevent even greater loss of life later. Augustus lived with these moral weights every single day for over 40 years. He had to project an image of divine authority. Romans increasingly saw their emperor as a godlike figure, while internally dealing with very human doubts, fears and mistakes. He had to make decisions about succession, knowing that choosing the wrong heir could plunge the empire into civil war after his death, but also knowing that he couldn't live forever and someone had to take over this impossible job. The practical aspects of wielding supreme power were equally challenging. Augustus had to understand military strategy well enough to direct generals, economic policy well enough to manage the empire's finances, engineering well enough to approve massive construction projects, law well enough to settle legal disputes, diplomacy well enough to negotiate with foreign kingdoms, and religion well enough to maintain the complex spiritual traditions that held Roman society together. He essentially had to be an expert in every field that affected human civilization, because ultimately, every major decision came to his desk. But let's move forward in time and across the world to explore a different kind of ultimate power. In 13th century Mongolia, a man named Temujin, who became known as Genghis Khan, wielded a form of power that was perhaps even more absolute than Augustus's. Genghis Khan didn't just rule over people, he had the power to completely erase entire civilizations from existence. His armies could appear seemingly out of nowhere, moving faster than any military force in history up to that point, and they had the capability to destroy cities so thoroughly that grass would grow where great urban centers once stood. Imagine having that level of destructive power at your command, knowing that if you gave the order, entire cultures, languages, and ways of life could disappear forever. Genghis Khan started as an orphan child, living in poverty on the Mongolian steppes, struggling to survive in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But through a combination of strategic brilliance, ruthless determination, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in his followers, he built the largest contiguous land empire in human history. By the time he reached the height of his power, his armies controlled territory from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, and his decisions affected the lives of people from Kiev to Beijing. The psychological burden of this kind of power was immense. Genghis Khan had to constantly balance showing mercy, which might be seen as weakness and encourage rebellion, with showing strength, which often meant ordering mass executions that would terrify his enemies into submission. He developed a military doctrine where cities that surrendered immediately would be spared, but cities that resisted would be completely destroyed as an example to others. This meant that every time he approached a new city, he was essentially giving its inhabitants a choice between life and death, knowing that his reputation for following through on threats was what made this strategy effective. The loneliness of Genghis Khan's position was different from Augustus's, but equally profound. He could trust no one completely, because anyone with access to him had the potential to poison his food, stab him in his sleep, or betray his location to enemies. He had to constantly move between different camps and locations, never staying in one place long enough for potential assassins to plan an attack. His own family members were both his greatest source of support and his greatest potential threat, because they were the most likely candidates to succeed him and therefore had the strongest motivation to accelerate that succession. Genghis Khan had to make decisions about which of his sons and generals to trust with important missions, knowing that giving them too much success and independence might make them powerful enough to challenge his authority, but not giving them enough authority might result in military failures that could threaten the entire empire. He had to decide which conquered peoples to integrate into his growing empire and which to eliminate entirely, understanding that mercy might be seen as weakness, but excessive cruelty might unite his enemies against him. The practical challenges of ruling such a vast territory with medieval technology were staggering. Communications across the empire could take months, meaning that by the time Genghis Khan received reports of problems in distant regions, those problems might have escalated into major crises. He had to develop an incredibly sophisticated intelligence network, using merchants, diplomats, and spies to keep track of what was happening across thousands of miles of territory. He had to manage an army that was constantly on the move, ensuring they had enough food, weapons, and supplies while also maintaining the mobility that made them so effective in battle. But perhaps most challenging of all, Genghis Khan had to grapple with the question of what his empire was ultimately for. Unlike Augustus, who inherited the established civilization with existing institutions and traditions, Genghis Khan was essentially creating a new form of human organization from scratch. He had to decide what laws would govern this vast, diverse population, how to handle trade and commerce across cultures that had never interacted before, how to manage religious differences between conquered peoples, and how to create some kind of lasting structure that could survive after his death. The weight of literally reshaping human civilization was something that very few people in history have ever had to bear. Let's jump forward several centuries to explore yet another form of ultimate power, this time in 16th century Europe with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. Charles inherited a collection of territories so vast and complex that he supposedly said the sun never set on his domains, a phrase that would later be associated with the British Empire. He controlled Spain and its rapidly expanding American colonies, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, Austria, and held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, which gave him theoretical authority over much of Central Europe. But Charles V's power came with a unique set of psychological challenges because, unlike Augustus or Genghis Khan, he was trying to hold together an empire that was incredibly diverse culturally, linguistically, and religiously during a time of massive social and religious upheaval. This was the era of the Protestant Reformation, when Martin Luther and other reformers were challenging the Catholic Church's authority, and Charles, as a devout Catholic, felt personally responsible for maintaining religious unity in his territories. Imagine trying to sleep at night, knowing that your decisions about religious policy could determine whether millions of people lived in peace or were caught up in religious wars that could last for generations. Charles had to balance his personal religious convictions with the political reality that forcing religious uniformity might provoke rebellions that could tear his empire apart. He spent much of his reign traveling constantly between his various territories, from Spain to the Netherlands, to Germany to Italy, trying to personally manage crises that were erupting faster than he could address them. The physical and emotional toll of this constant travel, constant decision-making, and constant crisis management was enormous. Charles would often spend months on the road, living in temporary accommodations, eating irregular meals, and dealing with the stress of knowing that every delay in his travel might allow a problem in one of his territories to spiral out of control. He had to master multiple languages and understand the unique political, economic, and cultural situations in each of his domains. What worked in Spain might be completely inappropriate in the Netherlands. What satisfied German princes might offend Italian nobles. Every decision had to be carefully calibrated to account for these regional differences, and mistakes could have consequences that lasted for generations. Charles also had to deal with external threats that were unlike anything previous rulers had faced. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent was expanding into Europe from the southeast. French kings were constantly trying to break Habsburg power, and the discovery of the Americas was creating entirely new categories of administrative, economic, and moral challenges. He had to decide how to treat indigenous peoples in the New World, how to manage the enormous wealth flowing from American silver mines, how to prevent other European powers from establishing their own footholds in the Americas, and how to maintain control over territories that were thousands of miles away and took months to reach by ship. The loneliness of Charles's position was compounded by the fact that he could never really delegate ultimate responsibility to anyone else. He had governors and viceroys managing his various territories, but any major decision had to be referred back to him. And by the time his instructions reached distant locations, circumstances might have changed completely. He lived with the constant knowledge that somewhere in his vast empire, people were making decisions in his name that he might not approve of, but that he would ultimately be held responsible for. The financial pressures of maintaining such a vast empire were crushing. Charles was constantly borrowing money to fund his armies, his administration, and his court, and he spent much of his reign on the edge of bankruptcy, despite controlling some of the richest territories in the world. He had to balance the need to tax his subjects enough to fund his government with the risk that excessive taxation might provoke rebellions. He had to decide which military campaigns were worth the enormous expense they required and which territorial claims he should abandon to focus resources on more important areas. Perhaps most poignantly, Charles V eventually made a decision that almost no other ruler with ultimate power has ever made. He voluntarily gave it all up. In 1556, overwhelmed by the impossible demands of ruling such a vast and complex empire, Charles abdicated his thrones and retired to a monastery, dividing his territories between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand. He spent his final years in quiet contemplation, reportedly spending time taking apart and reassembling clocks, perhaps finding peace in the simple, predictable mechanics of timepieces after decades of dealing with the chaotic unpredictability of human politics. But let's explore a very different kind of ultimate power by traveling to 17th century France and the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis wielded what historians call absolute monarchy in its most refined form. He famously declared, "I am the state," and he meant it literally. Unlike previous rulers we've discussed, who had to contend with powerful nobles, independent cities, or religious authorities that limited their power, Louis XIV spent his long reign systematically eliminating any source of authority in France that didn't derive directly from him. The psychological experience of this kind of absolute power was unique in human history. Louis lived in a world where every aspect of daily life for millions of people was theoretically subject to his personal will. He could decide what people wore, what they ate, where they lived, whom they married, what they believed, and how they spent their time. But this absolute power came with the absolute responsibility of essentially micromanaging an entire civilization. Louis's daily routine at Versailles was choreographed down to the minute, not because he was constrained by protocol, but because he understood that every gesture, every word, every facial expression was being watched and interpreted by hundreds of nobles who were trying to understand his mood and predict his decisions. He lived his entire life as a performance, knowing that maintaining the mystique of royal authority required him to appear superhuman even in the most mundane activities. The famous ceremony of the lever, where nobles competed for the honor of helping the king get dressed each morning, wasn't just royal vanity. It was a carefully designed system for managing the psychology of power, ensuring that the most influential people in France started each day by performing acts of submission that reinforced their acceptance of Louis's authority. The loneliness of Louis's position was perhaps more complete than that of any ruler we've discussed so far. He could never have a genuine friendship, because every relationship was inherently unequal. He was always the king first and a person second. Even his romantic relationships were complicated by the fact that his partners knew their access to the most powerful person in Europe could dramatically improve their family's fortunes. He had to constantly evaluate whether people were responding to him as an individual or to his position, and the answer was almost always the latter. Louis's power extended into realms that previous monarchs had never tried to control. He dictated fashion trends, architectural styles, musical preferences, and even the topics of conversation that were acceptable in polite society. He built Versailles not just as a palace, but as a machine for generating and displaying royal power, creating a physical environment where every room, every garden path, every fountain was designed to reinforce the message that he was not just a political leader, but a force of nature. The practical challenges of absolute monarchy were immense. Louis had to personally approve thousands of decisions every year, from major military campaigns to minor court appointments. He read reports from his intendants, regional administrators, across France, tracking everything from tax collection to road repairs to grain prices to local crime rates. He understood that maintaining absolute power required him to demonstrate that he was better informed and more capable of making decisions than anyone else in the kingdom, which meant he had to develop genuine expertise in an incredibly wide range of fields. The financial costs of Louis's system of absolute monarchy were staggering. Versailles employed thousands of people and cost enormous amounts to maintain. His military campaigns to expand French territory and influence required constant funding. His system of royal patronage, which kept potentially rebellious nobles dependent on royal favor rather than independent sources of wealth and power, required him to constantly distribute money, titles, and privileges. By the end of his reign, these costs had put France in a financial crisis that would eventually contribute to the French Revolution several decades later. But perhaps the most profound challenge Louis faced was the question of legacy. He ruled for over 70 years, longer than most people lived in that era, and he spent much of his later reign trying to ensure that the system of absolute monarchy he had created would survive after his death. He had to train his heirs not just in the practical skills of government, but in the psychological techniques necessary to maintain absolute authority. He had to create institutions that could function according to his will, even when he wasn't there to personally direct them. The tragedy of Louis's reign was that despite his extraordinary success in concentrating power, many of the problems he suppressed through royal authority, religious conflicts, social inequality, financial instability, regional tensions, continued to exist beneath the surface and would eventually explode in ways that destroyed the very system he had worked so hard to perfect. Now let's shift our focus to a completely different cultural context and explore the power wielded by Chinese emperors, particularly during the height of the Qing dynasty in the 18th century under Emperor Qianlong. Chinese imperial power was based on the concept of the mandate of heaven, which held that the emperor was the son of heaven, personally chosen by divine forces to maintain harmony between the celestial and terrestrial realms. This meant that Qianlong didn't just rule over people. He was responsible for maintaining the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. Imagine the psychological weight of believing that natural disasters, crop failures, and social unrest weren't just political problems, but signs that you had personally failed in your cosmic responsibilities. Chinese emperors lived with the constant awareness that their legitimacy depended not just on political and military success, but on their ability to maintain the favor of heaven, as demonstrated by the prosperity and stability of their realm. Qianlong ruled over what was probably the largest population any human being had ever governed. Estimates suggest the Chinese Empire during his reign included over 300 million people, more than the entire population of Europe at the time. The administrative challenges of governing this many people with 18th century technology were mind-boggling. The emperor had to rely on a vast bureaucracy of scholars who had passed incredibly difficult examinations based on classical Chinese literature and philosophy. But he also had to ensure that this bureaucracy remained loyal to him personally, rather than developing independent sources of power. The Forbidden City in Beijing, where Qianlong lived, was designed to physically embody the concept of imperial power. The emperor was literally at the center of a series of concentric spaces, each more exclusive than the last, with access to each level carefully controlled according to rank and function. Most of the emperor's subjects would never see him in person. He was more like a mythological figure than a political leader in the modern sense. But this isolation, while enhancing the mystique of imperial power, also meant that Qianlong had to make decisions about the lives of hundreds of millions of people based on second-hand reports, filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy. Chinese imperial power also extended into cultural and intellectual realms in ways that Western monarchs never attempted. Qianlong was not just a political ruler, but the ultimate authority on questions of art, literature, philosophy, and even historical interpretation. He commissioned enormous scholarly projects like the Complete Library of the Four Treasuries, which attempted to collect and organize all significant Chinese literature, but he also ordered the destruction of books that he considered seditious or inappropriate. He had the power to literally determine what ideas would be preserved for future generations and what would be forgotten. The emperor's daily routine was governed by complex rituals that reinforced his cosmic significance. He had to perform ceremonies at specific times according to the lunar calendar, wear particular colors and symbols appropriate to different seasons and occasions, and follow dietary restrictions that were believed to maintain his spiritual purity. These weren't empty formalities. They were essential aspects of maintaining the mandate of heaven, and neglecting them could theoretically result in divine punishment that might manifest as earthquakes, floods, or rebellions. Qianlong also had to manage China's relationships with tributary states and foreign powers in ways that maintained Chinese prestige without provoking conflicts that could destabilize the empire. This was becoming increasingly challenging during his reign because European powers were beginning to establish a significant presence in East Asia, bringing new technologies, ideas, and military capabilities that didn't fit easily into traditional Chinese diplomatic frameworks. The emperor had to decide how much foreign influence to allow into China while maintaining the cultural and political systems that legitimized his authority. The loneliness of Chinese imperial power was perhaps more complete than any we've discussed, because the emperor was not just politically isolated, but spiritually isolated. He was believed to be fundamentally different from other human beings, chosen by heaven and responsible for maintaining cosmic harmony. This meant that even his closest advisors and family members had to interact with him according to elaborate protocols that emphasized his divine nature rather than his humanity. Personal relationships were almost impossible because everyone who interacted with the emperor was constantly aware of his cosmic significance and the potential consequences of offending heaven's chosen representative. Let's move into the modern era and explore a form of power that combined traditional imperial authority with industrial age technology and bureaucracy. In early 20th century Russia, Tsar Nicholas II wielded autocratic power over the largest territorial empire in human history, stretching from Poland in the west to Alaska in the east, until he sold Alaska to the United States, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups, languages, and religious traditions. But Nicholas's power was complicated by the fact that he was trying to maintain medieval forms of autocratic authority in an era when technology was making traditional forms of political control obsolete. Nicholas ruled over roughly 130 million people, spread across 11 time zones. And unlike previous rulers who could govern through personal relationships and face-to-face communication with their key subordinates, he had to rely on telegraphs, railways, and bureaucratic systems to maintain control over this vast territory. The psychological burden of autocratic power in the modern era was different from earlier periods, because Nicholas was constantly aware that other countries were developing more efficient forms of government that might make Russian autocracy obsolete. He lived with the tension between his belief that he was personally chosen by God to rule Russia and his awareness that social, economic, and political changes were making his form of government increasingly difficult to maintain. The practical challenges were enormous. Nicholas had to manage an empire that included everything from medieval peasant villages, where people lived, much as their ancestors had centuries earlier, to modern industrial cities, where workers were developing new forms of political consciousness, influenced by socialist and anarchist ideas spreading from Western Europe. He had to balance the demands of modernizing Russia's economy and military to compete with other great powers, while maintaining the traditional social and political structures that legitimized his authority. The Russo-Japanese War and World War I revealed the fundamental contradictions in Nicholas's position. He needed modern military technology and industrial capacity to maintain Russia's international position, but acquiring these capabilities required social and political changes that undermined the foundations of autocratic rule. The emperor found himself in the impossible position of trying to modernize Russia, while preventing the social changes that modernization inevitably brought. Nicholas's daily experience of power was increasingly dominated by crisis management. He would wake up each morning to reports of strikes in industrial cities, peasant unrest in rural areas, military defeats on various frontiers, economic problems caused by the enormous costs of maintaining a modern military, and political opposition from intellectuals and professionals who wanted to limit autocratic power. Unlike earlier autocrats, who could often solve problems through personal intervention or dramatic gestures, Nicholas discovered that modern problems required systematic institutional solutions that were difficult to implement through traditional autocratic methods. The loneliness of Nicholas's position was compounded by his awareness that the system of autocratic power he had inherited was probably unsustainable, but that any significant changes might lead to the complete collapse of the social order he was responsible for maintaining. He lived with the constant stress of knowing that every decision he made might either precipitate a revolution or fail to prevent one, and that the consequences of his choices would affect not just his own family, but millions of people across the empire. The tragedy of Nicholas II was that he was personally a decent man who genuinely wanted to serve his people, but he was trapped in a system of government that was becoming incompatible with the realities of modern life and his attempts to preserve. Autocratic power ultimately contributed to the violent revolution that destroyed not just his government, but his entire family. Now let's explore perhaps the most complex and psychologically demanding form of power in human history: the presidency of the United States during the 20th century, when America emerged as a global superpower with the capability to influence events anywhere on Earth. Unlike the rulers we've discussed so far, American presidents had to wield enormous power while operating within a constitutional system designed to limit and balance that power, creating psychological pressures that were unique in human experience. Consider Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II. He had access to military forces and industrial capacity greater than any previous ruler in human history, but he also had to convince Congress, the American people, and Allied leaders to support his decisions rather than simply commanding obedience. The psychological challenge of democratic leadership during a global crisis was that Roosevelt had to project confidence and decisive authority while internally dealing with uncertainty about whether his strategies would work and constant political pressure from people who had the constitutional right to oppose him. Roosevelt had to make decisions that affected not just Americans, but people around the world. His choices about military strategy, economic policy, and diplomatic relations would determine whether fascist or democratic systems would dominate the post-war world. But unlike dictators who could implement their decisions immediately, Roosevelt had to build consensus among multiple competing power centers, each with their own interests and perspectives. He had to manage relationships with Congress, the Supreme Court, state governors, military leaders, labor unions, business leaders, allied governments, and public opinion, all while maintaining the appearance of being in control of events that were often chaotic and unpredictable. The practical challenges of wielding democratic power during a global crisis were immense. Roosevelt had to master enough military strategy to direct a war being fought simultaneously in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, enough economics to manage the conversion of peacetime industry to wartime production, enough diplomacy to coordinate with allies who had very different political systems and war aims, and enough domestic politics to maintain popular support for policies that required enormous sacrifices from American civilians. The loneliness of Roosevelt's position was different from the isolation experienced by autocratic rulers, because he was surrounded by people who had the right to disagree with him and the power to oppose his decisions, but he was still ultimately responsible for choices that would determine the fate of millions of people. He had to maintain personal relationships with political allies while making decisions that might require him to sacrifice their interests for what he believed was the greater good. He had to project optimism and confidence in public, while privately grappling with doubts about whether America would be able to defeat enemies who had been preparing for war longer and had achieved significant early victories. But let's move to an even more psychologically complex example: the American presidency during the nuclear age. Consider John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. For 13 days, Kennedy held in his hands the power to initiate a nuclear war that could have killed hundreds of millions of people and potentially ended human civilization. The psychological pressure of making decisions when the stakes are literally the survival of the human species is something that no previous ruler in history had ever experienced. Kennedy had to balance multiple competing pressures: military advisors who believed that only a strong response would prevent Soviet expansion, allies who were terrified that American actions might trigger a nuclear war that would destroy Europe, domestic political opponents who would attack him for appearing weak, and his own moral responsibility for preventing a catastrophic war while also protecting American security interests. He had to make these decisions while knowing that every hour of delay increased the risk that events might spiral out of control, but also knowing that hasty action might precipitate exactly the kind of crisis he was trying to prevent. The practical challenges of nuclear-age leadership were unlike anything previous rulers had faced. Kennedy had to understand weapons technology sophisticated enough to destroy entire cities, military strategy that involved calculations about acceptable levels of casualties in the millions, and diplomatic complexities that required him to anticipate how Soviet leaders would interpret American actions and react accordingly. He had to make decisions based on intelligence that was often incomplete or contradictory, while knowing that mistakes could have consequences far beyond anything in previous human experience. The loneliness of Kennedy's position during the missile crisis was absolute, in a way that even previous examples of ultimate power had not been. He was surrounded by advisors, but the final decision about whether to risk nuclear war had to be his alone. He couldn't delegate this responsibility or share it with anyone else. He had to live with the knowledge that if he made the wrong choice, he would be personally responsible for a catastrophe that would make all previous wars and disasters in human history seem insignificant by comparison. But Kennedy's experience also illustrates how the nature of ultimate power had changed by the 20th century. Unlike autocratic rulers, who could often solve problems through personal will and dramatic action, Kennedy discovered that the most important decisions required careful calculation, patient negotiation, and willingness to accept partial solutions rather than complete victories. The missile crisis was resolved not through decisive military action, but through a complex diplomatic agreement that allowed both sides to avoid the appearance of defeat while stepping back from nuclear confrontation. Let's consider how ultimate power functions in the contemporary world by examining the unique challenges faced by leaders of modern superpowers. The President of the United States today wields military, economic, and cultural influence that can affect events anywhere on Earth. But this power operates within constraints that previous rulers never had to consider. Modern American presidents have to make decisions while being observed in real time by global media, social networks, and intelligence services from dozens of countries, meaning that every action is immediately analyzed, criticized, and responded to by people around the world. The psychological pressure of leading in the modern information age is that privacy and reflection time have essentially disappeared. Every decision is made under intense public scrutiny, and the consequences of those decisions are visible almost immediately. Consider the challenges faced by a modern president dealing with a global crisis like a pandemic, climate change, or international terrorism. These problems require coordinated responses involving multiple countries, international organizations, scientific experts, economic institutions, and social movements. But the president still bears ultimate responsibility for decisions that affect American citizens and people around the world. The complexity of modern problems means that no single individual can possibly understand all the factors involved in major decisions. But democratic accountability still requires someone to take responsibility for choices that emerge from vast bureaucratic and advisory processes. The loneliness of modern presidential power is compounded by the fact that presidents must make decisions about issues that affect future generations while being politically accountable to voters who are primarily concerned with immediate problems. A president might understand that climate change requires policies that impose short-term economic costs for long-term environmental benefits, but implementing those policies requires convincing people to accept immediate sacrifices for benefits they might not see for decades. The temporal mismatch between democratic political cycles and the long-term consequences of major decisions creates psychological pressures that previous rulers, who didn't have to worry about regular elections, never experienced. Modern presidents also have to navigate the reality that their power, while enormous, operates within a global system where other actors, multinational corporations, international organizations, terrorist groups, social movements, and foreign governments can influence events in ways that traditional state power cannot easily control. A president might have the theoretical authority to deploy military force anywhere in the world, but the practical effectiveness of that force depends on factors like international law, public opinion, economic consequences, and the responses of other global actors who have their own sources of power and influence. But let's step back and consider what all these historical examples tell us about the fundamental nature of ultimate power and its psychological effects on the human beings who wield it. One of the most striking patterns is that regardless of the historical period, cultural context, or political system, people with ultimate power consistently struggle with profound loneliness. This isn't just the ordinary loneliness that anyone might experience. It's the existential isolation that comes from being responsible for decisions that affect millions of lives while having no peers who truly understand the weight of that responsibility. Every relationship becomes complicated by the power differential. Every friendship is potentially compromised by political considerations. And every personal interaction is filtered through the lens of authority and responsibility that never disappears. Another universal aspect of ultimate power is the burden of making decisions with incomplete information under enormous time pressure. Whether we're talking about Augustus trying to manage the Roman Empire with communication systems that took months to carry messages across the empire, or a modern president dealing with international crises that unfold in real time on social media, the fundamental challenge remains the same. Leaders have to make choices that will affect countless lives based on limited information, often while facing artificial deadlines that don't allow for the careful deliberation that such important decisions deserve. The psychological toll of this constant decision-making under pressure is something that shows up in historical accounts of rulers from every era: sleepless nights, physical health problems, premature aging, and the kind of mental exhaustion that comes from carrying enormous responsibility without being able to fully share that burden with anyone else. Perhaps most significantly, ultimate power seems to create a fundamental disconnect between the public perception of leadership and the private reality of what it feels like to be responsible for such momentous decisions. From the outside, people with ultimate power appear to be in complete control of events, able to shape history according to their will and vision. But from the inside, the experience is often one of constantly reacting to crises, trying to manage forces that are too large and complex to fully control, and making the best decisions possible with imperfect information while hoping that the consequences won't be catastrophic. This disconnect helps explain why so many powerful leaders throughout history have been fascinated by relatively simple, predictable activities: Augustus's interest in poetry, Charles V's clockmaking, Louis XIV's elaborate court rituals, or modern presidents' focus on routine activities that provide a brief respite from the overwhelming complexity of their official responsibilities. These activities offer a psychological refuge where cause and effect are clear, where skill and effort lead to predictable results, and where the stakes are low enough that mistakes don't have catastrophic consequences. The question of whether ultimate power inevitably corrupts the people who wield it is more complex than simple moral judgments might suggest. Certainly, history provides numerous examples of rulers who use their authority for personal gratification rather than public benefit, who became increasingly detached from the reality of their subjects' lives, and who made decisions based on maintaining their own power rather than serving the greater good. But history also provides examples of leaders who genuinely tried to use their authority responsibly, who made enormous personal sacrifices for what they believed was the public good, and who struggled with the moral implications of their decisions in ways that suggest they retained their basic humanity despite wielding enormous power. What seems more accurate than claims about power inevitably corrupting people is that ultimate power creates psychological pressures and moral dilemmas that are almost impossible for human beings to handle perfectly. The combination of enormous responsibility, social isolation, constant pressure, incomplete information, and the knowledge that mistakes can have catastrophic consequences creates a psychological environment that would challenge anyone's mental health, moral judgment, and decision-making capacity. Some people handle these pressures better than others, but no one emerges from the experience of ultimate power unchanged, and many are damaged by it in ways that affect both their personal lives and their ability to govern effectively. The historical record also suggests that the nature of ultimate power has changed dramatically over time in ways that have made it both more powerful and more psychologically demanding. Ancient and medieval rulers had more limited ability to affect events beyond their immediate territories, but they also had more direct control over the people and resources within their domains. Modern leaders can influence events anywhere in the world, but they operate within complex systems of international law, global economics, media scrutiny, and democratic accountability that constrain their freedom of action in ways that previous rulers never experienced. This evolution of power has created new forms of psychological pressure that are uniquely modern. The stress of making decisions while being constantly observed and criticized by global audiences. The challenge of maintaining authority while operating within democratic systems that require consensus building and compromise, and the burden of dealing with problems that are global in scope but must be addressed through political systems that are still fundamentally national in structure. Consider the unique psychological challenges faced by someone like Nelson Mandela when he became president of South Africa in 1994. Mandela had to wield ultimate power in a country that was emerging from decades of apartheid, where racial tensions were at their highest point in the nation's history, and where the wrong decision could have triggered a civil war that would have killed millions of people. But unlike previous rulers who could impose their will through force, Mandela had to use his authority to build a new form of society based on reconciliation rather than revenge, democracy rather than autocracy, and inclusion rather than exclusion. The psychological complexity of Mandela's position was that he had to embody both ultimate power and ultimate restraint. He needed to demonstrate that he had the authority to reshape South African society while also showing that he would not use that authority to seek revenge against the people who had oppressed him and his supporters for decades. This required a form of moral leadership that went beyond traditional political power, combining the practical skills of governance with the spiritual discipline of forgiveness on a scale that few human beings have ever attempted. Mandela's daily experience of power involved constant balancing between the expectations of his supporters, who wanted to see dramatic changes that would address decades of injustice, and the fears of the white minority, who were terrified that majority rule would lead to the kind of violence and economic collapse that had occurred in other African countries when colonial systems ended. He had to make decisions about land reform, economic policy, criminal justice, and social programs, while maintaining the delicate coalition that had made the transition from apartheid possible. The loneliness of Mandela's position was perhaps unique in human history because he was simultaneously the most beloved and most burdened leader of his generation. Millions of people around the world saw him as a moral icon, but that iconic status made it almost impossible for him to express doubts, fears, or uncertainties that would have been natural for anyone facing such enormous responsibilities. He had to maintain an image of moral certainty and optimistic leadership, while internally wrestling with problems that had no clear solutions and making decisions that would affect the lives of millions of people for generations to come. But let's also consider the psychological experience of wielding ultimate power in societies that explicitly rejected traditional forms of authority. During the French Revolution, figures like Robespierre found themselves in the position of trying to exercise ultimate power, while simultaneously destroying the institutional foundations that had traditionally legitimized such power. Robespierre and his fellow revolutionaries had to create entirely new forms of political authority based on popular sovereignty and revolutionary virtue, rather than hereditary right or divine mandate. The psychological challenge for revolutionary leaders was that they had to maintain their authority while constantly proving that they deserved it through their commitment to revolutionary principles that often demanded personal sacrifice and moral purity that was impossible to maintain in practice. Robespierre lived with the constant fear that he would be accused of betraying the revolution or becoming the kind of tyrant that the revolution had been designed to eliminate. This created a form of psychological pressure that was different from traditional autocratic power. Instead of worrying about external enemies or rebellious subjects, revolutionary leaders had to constantly demonstrate their ideological purity to followers who were watching for any sign of corruption or betrayal of revolutionary principles. The practical challenges of revolutionary power were enormous because the revolutionaries had to simultaneously destroy the old system of government and create a new one while dealing with external enemies who wanted to restore the old regime, and internal enemies who believed the revolution wasn't radical enough. Robespierre had to make decisions about who was a true revolutionary and who was a secret counter-revolutionary, knowing that mistakes in either direction could either allow the revolution to be destroyed from within or lead to the execution of innocent people. The terror that characterized the most radical phase of the French Revolution was in many ways a reflection of the psychological impossibility of exercising ultimate power while maintaining the moral purity that revolutionary ideology demanded. The logic of revolutionary power required constant vigilance against enemies of the people, but the practical exercise of that vigilance required making life and death decisions about individuals based on limited evidence and political calculations that inevitably involved moral compromises. Robespierre ultimately became a victim of the same revolutionary logic he had helped create. He was executed by people who believed that his exercise of power had betrayed the very principles that justified that power in the first place. The experience of revolutionary leaders like Robespierre illustrates how the psychological challenges of ultimate power are magnified when that power is exercised in the name of moral principles that don't allow for the kind of pragmatic compromises that governance usually requires. When leaders believe they are implementing the will of the people or the requirements of historical progress, they can't acknowledge the uncertainty, moral ambiguity, and practical limitations that are inherent in any exercise of political power. This creates a form of psychological pressure that is almost impossible to sustain. Leaders must project absolute moral certainty while making decisions that inevitably involve moral trade-offs and practical compromises that contradict their stated principles. Let's shift our focus to examine how ultimate power functions in contexts where traditional political authority has broken down entirely. During periods of civil war, revolution, or social collapse, power often becomes more personal and immediate than it is in stable political systems, but it also becomes more precarious and psychologically demanding. Consider someone like Toussaint Louverture during the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Louverture had to exercise ultimate power in a society that was simultaneously fighting for independence from French colonial rule, trying to abolish slavery, dealing with internal conflicts between different groups of former slaves and free people of color, and managing economic relationships with other countries that were still heavily involved in the slave trade. The psychological complexity of Louverture's position was that he had to lead a revolution that was more radical than any other in human history up to that point. Not just a change in political leadership or even political systems, but a complete transformation of the racial and economic foundations of society. He had to make decisions about military strategy, economic policy, and social organization, while knowing that failure would mean not just political defeat, but the re-enslavement of hundreds of thousands of people who had risked everything to achieve their freedom. Louverture's daily experience of power involved constant balancing between the need to maintain military discipline and unity among his followers, the need to demonstrate to other countries that Haiti could function as an independent nation, and the need to address the practical challenges of governing a society that was emerging from centuries of brutal exploitation. He had to make decisions about land distribution, labor organization, trade relationships, and legal systems, while fighting a war against some of the most powerful military forces in the world. The loneliness of Louverture's position was compounded by the fact that he was leading a revolution that challenged not just French colonial rule, but the entire international system of slavery and racial oppression that most of the world still considered natural and necessary. He couldn't look to other countries for models of how to organize a society of former slaves, and he couldn't count on support from other revolutionary movements because even the most radical European revolutionaries were uncomfortable with the implications of racial equality. Louverture had to create new forms of political and social organization essentially from scratch. while dealing with internal divisions among his supporters and external pressure from countries that wanted to see the Haitian Revolution fail, because its success would threaten their own slave-based economies. The tragedy of Louverture's story was that despite his extraordinary success in leading the Haitian Revolution, he was ultimately betrayed by the French, who tricked him into attending negotiations and then imprisoned him in France, where he died in captivity. His experience illustrates how exercising ultimate power in revolutionary situations requires not just political and military skill, but the ability to maintain hope and determination in the face of overwhelming odds and the constant possibility that betrayal or defeat could come from unexpected directions. But let's also consider how ultimate power functions in situations where traditional political structures exist but have become ineffective or corrupt. During the later years of the Roman Republic, figures like Julius Caesar found themselves in the position of wielding ultimate power without the institutional legitimacy that had traditionally justified such authority. Caesar had to exercise what was essentially imperial power, while maintaining the fiction that he was operating within the republican system that he was actually destroying. The psychological challenge for Caesar was that he had to simultaneously preserve and transform Roman political institutions. He needed to maintain enough continuity with traditional forms of authority to avoid provoking a complete breakdown of social order. But he also needed to make changes dramatic enough to address the problems that had made the traditional system ineffective. This required a form of political leadership that combined conservative respect for tradition with revolutionary willingness to break with established practices when they became obstacles to effective governance. Caesar's daily experience of power involved constant navigation between competing demands from different factions within Roman society. Military veterans who wanted land and rewards for their service, urban masses who wanted bread and entertainment, senators who wanted to maintain their traditional privileges, provincial governors who wanted more autonomy, and foreign rulers who wanted stable relationships with Rome. He had to make decisions about military campaigns, economic policy, legal reforms and administrative changes while maintaining the political coalition that had brought him to power and preventing the emergence of opposition coalitions that could threaten his authority. The loneliness of Caesar's position was that he was essentially creating a new form of government while pretending to preserve the old one, which required him to constantly calculate the political effects of his decisions while maintaining the appearance of acting according to traditional republican principles. He couldn't openly acknowledge that he was exercising imperial power, because doing so would have provoked immediate opposition from republicans who were committed to traditional forms of government. But he also couldn't govern effectively without exercising powers that went far beyond what republican institutions traditionally allowed. Caesar's assassination was in many ways the inevitable result of this fundamental contradiction. He was killed by people who believed they were defending republican government against tyranny, but his death led to civil wars that ultimately destroyed the republican system they were trying to preserve. His experience illustrates how exercising ultimate power during periods of institutional transition requires leaders to manage not just practical problems of governance, but also the psychological and political challenges of legitimizing new forms of authority, while maintaining continuity with traditional sources of legitimacy. The story of Caesar and the end of the Roman Republic also demonstrates how ultimate power can become self-defeating when it requires leaders to make decisions that undermine the very foundations of their authority. Caesar needed to exercise imperial power to address the problems that republican institutions couldn't solve, but exercising that power made him appear to be a tyrant who was destroying the political system that Romans believed was essential to their identity and freedom. This created a psychological trap where effective governance required actions that appeared to contradict the moral and political principles that justified governance in the first place. Let's examine how ultimate power functions in modern contexts, where democratic institutions exist but are under severe stress. Consider the psychological challenges faced by leaders of democratic countries during existential crises like world wars, economic depressions, or social revolutions. These leaders have to exercise powers that approach those of traditional autocrats, while maintaining the appearance of operating within democratic constraints and preserving the institutional foundations of democratic government for future generations. Winston Churchill during World War II provides an excellent example of this kind of leadership challenge. Churchill had to make decisions that would determine whether democratic civilization would survive the challenge of fascism, but he had to make those decisions while maintaining the support of a democratic parliament, a free press, and a public that had the right to remove him from office if they disagreed with his policies. The psychological pressure of democratic leadership during an existential crisis was that Churchill had to project absolute confidence in ultimate victory while internally dealing with the very real possibility that Britain might be defeated, invaded, and occupied by Nazi Germany. He had to make decisions about military strategy, economic mobilization, and diplomatic relationships while knowing that mistakes could lead not just to his personal political downfall, but to the complete destruction of the political system he was trying to preserve. Churchill's daily experience of power involved constant balancing between the need to maintain morale and unity among the British people and the need to be honest about the severity of the challenges they faced. He had to make speeches that inspired hope and determination while privately wrestling with intelligence reports that often contained alarming information about British military weakness and German military strength. He had to manage relationships with military commanders who sometimes disagreed with his strategic decisions, political opponents who questioned his leadership, and allied leaders who had their own national interests that sometimes conflicted with British interests. The loneliness of Churchill's position was that he bore ultimate responsibility for decisions that would determine the fate of democratic civilization, but he had to make those decisions while being constantly second-guessed by people who had access to less information than he did, but who retained the democratic right to oppose his policies. He couldn't simply command obedience the way an autocratic leader might, but he also couldn't afford to spend unlimited time building consensus when immediate action was needed to address military crises that were developing faster than democratic institutions could respond. Churchill's success in leading Britain through World War II required him to find ways to exercise something approaching ultimate power while preserving the democratic institutions and values that made that power legitimate. This required a form of political leadership that was simultaneously authoritarian and democratic. He had to make decisions quickly and decisively while maintaining the transparency and accountability that democratic government requires. The psychological toll of this kind of leadership was enormous. Churchill suffered from what he called his black dog of depression, drank heavily, worked obsessively, and showed signs of the kind of mental and physical exhaustion that comes from carrying enormous responsibility over extended periods. But his experience also demonstrates that it is possible to exercise ultimate power responsibly within democratic institutions, even under the most extreme circumstances. The key seems to be maintaining a clear distinction between the temporary exercise of extraordinary power to address extraordinary circumstances and the permanent transformation of democratic institutions into autocratic ones. Churchill was able to wield near-dictatorial power during the war, while ensuring that those powers would be returned to normal democratic processes once the crisis was resolved. Now let's consider how ultimate power functions in the contemporary world, where traditional forms of political authority compete with new sources of power that emerge from technology, economics, and social movements. Modern leaders have to exercise authority in contexts where their decisions can be instantly transmitted around the world, analyzed by experts and critics, and responded to by other powerful actors who may not be constrained by the same institutional limitations that constrain traditional political leaders. Consider the unique challenges faced by leaders of major technology companies who wield influence over global communications, commerce, and information in ways that can affect billions of people, but who are not accountable to democratic institutions in the same way that traditional political leaders are. These technological leaders have to make decisions about content moderation, data privacy, algorithmic design, and platform policies that can influence elections, social movements, and cultural trends around the world. But they make these decisions as private individuals running private companies, rather than as public officials accountable to democratic processes. The psychological challenge for technological leaders is that they wield power that is in some ways greater than that of traditional political leaders. They can influence what information billions of people see, how they communicate with each other, and how they understand current events. But they exercise this power without the institutional supports and constraints that have traditionally helped political leaders manage the psychological burdens of authority. They have to make decisions that affect global society while being primarily accountable to shareholders and market forces rather than to the people who are affected by their decisions. The loneliness of technological power is different from traditional political power because it is less visible and less understood by the general public, but it may be more consequential in the long run. A decision by a major technology company about algorithmic design can influence how millions of people understand political issues. But that decision is made by private individuals in corporate boardrooms rather than through democratic processes that allow for public input and accountability. This creates a form of power that is simultaneously enormous and precarious. Technological leaders can influence global events, but they are also vulnerable to market forces, regulatory changes, and public opinion shifts that can dramatically reduce their influence very quickly. The experience of technological leaders illustrates how ultimate power in the contemporary world is increasingly exercised by people who are not traditional political leaders, but whose decisions have political consequences that can be as significant as those made by presidents and prime ministers. This creates new forms of psychological pressure because these leaders have to manage the moral and practical challenges of wielding enormous influence while operating within institutional frameworks that were not designed to handle this kind of power. But let's also consider how ultimate power functions in contexts where traditional state authority has broken down entirely, and power is exercised by non-state actors who control territory, resources, and populations without being recognized as legitimate governments by the international community. Leaders of major criminal organizations, terrorist groups, or rebel movements often exercise forms of ultimate power within their spheres of influence that are as complete as those wielded by traditional political leaders. But they do so without the institutional legitimacy that makes traditional political power psychologically manageable. Consider the psychological challenges faced by someone who controls a major drug trafficking organization that operates across multiple countries and affects the lives of millions of people through its influence on violence, corruption, and economic activity. Such a leader has to make decisions about resource allocation, territorial control, personnel management, and strategic planning that require many of the same skills as traditional political leadership. But they have to do so while operating outside the law and being constantly pursued by law enforcement agencies from multiple countries. The psychological burden of this kind of power is that it combines enormous influence with complete insecurity. A leader of a major criminal organization can affect the lives of millions of people and control resources worth billions of dollars, but they can never be sure that they won't be arrested, killed by rivals, or betrayed by subordinates. They have to exercise ultimate power while living in constant fear of losing everything, which creates psychological pressures that are different from those faced by traditional political leaders who operate within more stable institutional frameworks. The loneliness of criminal power is perhaps more complete than any other form of ultimate power, because it requires leaders to trust no one completely while depending on others for their survival and success. Criminal leaders can't rely on institutional loyalty or legal protections to maintain their authority. They have to maintain control through a combination of fear, personal relationships, and strategic calculation that requires constant vigilance and creates enormous psychological stress. The experience of criminal leaders illustrates how ultimate power can exist in contexts where traditional moral and legal frameworks provide no guidance for decision-making. These leaders have to create their own systems of rules and values while operating in environments where violence and betrayal are constant possibilities. This requires a form of psychological adaptation that may be fundamentally different from the mental processes required for traditional political leadership, but it also demonstrates the basic human capacity to exercise authority and make decisions that affect large numbers of people, even under the most challenging circumstances. As we near the end of our exploration of ultimate power throughout history, it's worth reflecting on what these diverse examples tell us about the fundamental nature of human leadership and authority. One of the most striking patterns is that, regardless of the historical period, cultural context, or institutional framework, people who wield ultimate power consistently face similar psychological challenges: loneliness, uncertainty, moral complexity, and the burden of making decisions with incomplete information under enormous pressure. These challenges seem to be inherent in the nature of ultimate power itself, rather than products of specific political systems or historical circumstances. Another important pattern is that ultimate power seems to require people to develop psychological capacities that go beyond normal human experience. Successful leaders throughout history have had to learn to function effectively while carrying levels of responsibility that would overwhelm most people, to make decisions that affect millions of lives while maintaining emotional stability, and to project confidence and authority while internally dealing with doubt and uncertainty. This suggests that leadership at the highest levels requires not just political skills, but also extraordinary psychological resilience and emotional intelligence. Perhaps most significantly, the historical record suggests that ultimate power is fundamentally a collective human creation rather than something that individuals possess independently. Even the most autocratic rulers in history depended on the cooperation of thousands of other people to implement their decisions, and their power was ultimately based on the willingness of others to accept their authority rather than on their individual capabilities alone. This means that ultimate power is always, in some sense, a social relationship rather than a personal attribute, and understanding how it functions requires examining not just the psychology of leaders, but also the social and cultural factors that make people willing to grant authority to specific individuals. The evolution of ultimate power over time also reveals important changes in how human societies organize themselves and distribute authority. Ancient and medieval forms of power were often based on claims about divine mandate, hereditary right, or personal charisma that were difficult to challenge or verify. Modern forms of power are increasingly based on claims about technical expertise, democratic legitimacy, or institutional effectiveness that can be more easily evaluated and contested. This evolution suggests that human societies are gradually developing more sophisticated ways of thinking about authority and accountability, but it also creates new forms of psychological pressure for leaders who have to justify their decisions in ways that previous rulers never had to. The contemporary challenges facing leaders of democracies, international organizations, and global corporations suggest that ultimate power in the modern world requires even more complex psychological and political skills than it did in previous eras. Modern leaders have to operate within institutional frameworks that are designed to limit and balance power, while dealing with problems that often require quick, decisive action. They have to maintain authority while being constantly scrutinized by global media and public opinion. They have to make decisions about issues that affect people around the world while being primarily accountable to specific national or organizational constituencies. These challenges require forms of leadership that combine many of the skills that were previously needed for different types of power: the strategic thinking of military commanders, the negotiation skills of diplomats, the communication abilities of public speakers, the analytical capabilities of scholars, and the emotional intelligence of counselors and therapists. As we look toward the future, it seems likely that the nature of ultimate power will continue to evolve in ways that make it both more influential and more psychologically demanding. Global challenges like climate change, technological disruption, and social inequality require forms of leadership that can coordinate action across traditional boundaries of nation-states, industries, and cultural groups. This will likely require leaders who can exercise authority within multiple institutional frameworks simultaneously, while maintaining legitimacy with diverse constituencies that may have conflicting interests and values. The psychological challenges of future leadership may be even more complex than those faced by historical leaders, because the pace of change is accelerating, the consequences of decisions are becoming more far-reaching, and the number of people who can influence events is increasing. Future leaders will need to develop new forms of psychological resilience and emotional intelligence to handle the stress of wielding ultimate power in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. But perhaps the most important insight from our exploration of ultimate power throughout history is that despite the enormous challenges and psychological burdens involved, human beings have consistently found ways to exercise authority responsibly and effectively even under the most difficult circumstances. The historical record includes many examples of leaders who used their power to improve the lives of their people, who made personal sacrifices for the greater good, and who left the world better than they found it, despite facing pressures that would have overwhelmed most people. This suggests that while ultimate power will always be psychologically demanding and morally complex, it is possible for human beings to wield such authority in ways that serve human flourishing rather than simply personal ambition. The key seems to be maintaining a clear sense of purpose that extends beyond personal power, developing strong support systems that can help leaders manage the psychological burdens of authority, and creating institutional frameworks that encourage responsible leadership while providing accountability for the abuse of power. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine what it would feel like to carry the weight of ultimate power, to know that your decisions affect the lives of millions of people, and to face the daily challenge of trying to use that awesome responsibility wisely and well. The story of ultimate power is ultimately the story of human beings trying to organize themselves in ways that promote cooperation, justice, and prosperity, despite the inevitable conflicts and challenges that arise when people with different interests and values try to live together. It's a story that continues to unfold today, and one that will shape the future of human civilization in ways that we can only begin to imagine. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the psychology and history of ultimate power.